Hello and welcome to week 6. So I hope the midterm last week went well for everybody. We are now officially in the second half of our course, and today we will be starting the second half of our course with the Flavian Dynasty. So the Flavians were the successors to Nero. They are a dynasty, which means they are all related. It's made up of 3 emperors, and we'll be looking at them in succession today. And I was going to say that this is a very important lecture, but I feel like I say that every lecture, so they're all important, I guess. But this one is important because we will be learning about the monument that you see in front of you, the Colosseum, otherwise known as the Flavian Amphitheater. Just a note also about where we are going with the course. So the next couple classes, we're going to be looking at emperors, kind of an emperor-focused lecture. But then after that, we're going to start looking at the provinces. And so you might notice that that's one of the paper prompts is to write a research paper about the provinces. So if you choose that one, just do the best you can on the paper proposal because we'll be learning a ton more about them in detail. I think the end of next week and then the beginning of the week after that. So kind of hold tight if that's the one you've picked, because for now we're still looking at some emperors. So to get us started with the Flavians, I want to look back at what we left off with right before the midterm, and that was Nero, right? So Nero was the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, and that dynasty definitely went out with a bang. Nero, a very larger-than-life figure, right? He was dealt in extremes. People loved him or hated him, and their hatred of him eventually led to his suicide when there was a mob that kind of came after him. So rather than being captured and probably executed, he chose to commit suicide himself. But that ends the Julio-Claudian dynasty, and what we see after that is a bit of a power scramble, a bit of a civil war, because there's not a clear plan for who's going to succeed Nero, especially because he was so disliked by a lot of people in the Senate and in politics that they wanted to kind of get away from what he had been and pick someone new. So what we see is the year of 4 emperors. So in the year 69 CE, we see 4 different emperors reigning over the Roman Empire. And the way this happens is because there is a civil war. So after the death of Nero, we see Galba take power. So Galba is there on the left. He was first recognized by the Senate as the emperor. He was a military commander and he was declared emperor by his troops. He was kind of the one that they nominated. He actually did have close ties to the Julio-Claudians. He was a bit older when he came into power. He was around 70 years old, so he had a lot of experience and was kind of a well-known figure. But he was not emperor for very long. So after that, the Praetorian Guard, who was I think we talked about them, yeah, the kind of secret service of the emperor. They're kind of the emperor's troops. He fell out of favor with them, and so they decided to install their own candidate as emperor, who was Otho. And so Otho, we see in the middle there, took power in January of 69. Galba was assassinated, and Otho became emperor. And then after that, we see that people also did not like Otho. We actually see sort of real civil war battles break out between rival groups of troops, rival kind of military contingents. And we see that break out between Otho and Vitellius, who you see there on your right, who is also a military commander. All of these men, military generals. Otho is defeated in battle by Vitellius, and Vitellius then becomes emperor. Before we move on to that, so that kind of rounds us out for the year 69 for now. I want to look quickly at their portraits because they share something that we've been talking a lot about recently, which is this move away from idealized portraiture toward more realistic portraiture. So these are not the heroic model, young, athletic figures that we see in the classical period that we saw under Augustus. We are getting into something now called verism or veristic portraits. And verism, as you can see, refers to hyperrealism. So this isn't just that they look like real people, it's that these flaws almost, or these indicators that are very realistic are over exaggerated. They're really emphasized to almost an unnatural degree. They're almost so realistic that they become unrealistic, just because we see really, really deep wrinkles. We see really, really sagging, like lower eyelids, big crow's feet, things like that. So if we look at Galba, right, on his coin, we can see really deep nasolabial lines. We talked about that term, these lines that come from your nose, right? We see sort of wrinkles in his eyes and his under eye bags, right? This big hooked nose. And just overall looks aged, right? He doesn't look super young. Otho does look a little bit younger, but still not super idealized. You know, we see definitely some thickness to his face, to his chest. He has also kind of an odd shaped nose, a big forehead brow that kind of goes over his eyes. And again, we do see some under eye bags and some lines on his eyelids. And we see this very pointed chin and very like pursed lips. And then lastly, with Vitellius, we see a similar thing, although not on a coin. We also see, again, those really deep eye bags, really deep, especially on this one, nasolabial lines. He was a bit older too. You can see the forehead creases there, right? These lines in his forehead, and he has the double chin and then also kind of lines in his chin. So overall, these don't look like your heroes of myth, right? These look like well, especially with Galba and Vitellius, look like older, much more experienced men. And so that's sort of why they chose to be so veristic, why they chose to really emphasize that realism. They want to show their age, they want to show their experience, they want to show that they're not, you know, young kids like Nero was, who was 17 when he took the throne, right? They want to show that they are old, and they're not hiding that. They're not like Augustus trying to hide the fact that they're older. They are proud of that because that shows their experience and their ability to lead, right? The fact that they have all this experience would make them a good emperor. And when you are in a civil war like this, that's what you're going to try to do. You want to legitimize your power. You want to convince people that you are the right one to rule. So they're trying to do that with these portraits. They're trying to emphasize that they're not like Nero. They're a little bit older, more experienced, and they are the right people to lead. So this idea of verism also we've talked about a little bit before, because Claudius had some of that, right? Where he starts to really show his age too. And that's kind of the first foray that we see into that. And I mentioned with Claudius that the reason he might have been doing that, or one of the reasons, was because he was obsessed with the Republic. He loved the Republican period. He was really interested in that. And he even wrote a history of the Republic. And I know we didn't talk about it when we talked about Republican art. And if I teach this course again, I think I might want to introduce that sooner, but we just didn't have time this time. But this is a portrait from the Republic. So just to show you 50 BC, so that's very late Republic, but what these veristic portraits in the Republic looked like, right? And we see a very similar thing. So there was precedent for this, that we see those really deep wrinkles, you know, over exaggerated lines in the forehead and in the creases of the eye, right? Look at all those lines that are coming out, really deep nasolabial lines. So we start to see a reversion to that, right? We went from this, and then we see kind of a reception of it, or a renewal of it. And so just because we are coming back from the midterm and we're starting this second half of the course, I want to quickly review what we've been through with sculpture styles, right? So we started with the Archaic, and hopefully this is all review for you because you studied so much for the midterm that you got this down already. But we started with Archaic, right? A little bit more abstracted, a little bit less naturalistic. You know, the Archaic smile and geometric shapes kind of categorizes that. Then we moved to the classical. So the classical is going to look very kind of elegant, I guess. There's these really deep dramatic folds in the clothing you can see, especially on Aphrodite here. There's also the contrapposto pose. It looks much more naturalistic and also very idealized. And there's a sense of calmness about it. The figures often look kind of serene or relaxed, but sort of elegant in that way. So that's the classical period. And then from the classical, we go to the Hellenistic Baroque, it's also called. And we looked at this when we looked at the grotto, right? Tiberius's grotto, because he had a revival of the Hellenistic. And so what we see there is the Laocoon, right? And super dramatic, over the top, really expressive. That's what categorizes the Hellenistic, that we still see in a way some of the same naturalistic elements, that these still look like real people, their body forms, their anatomy is very correct, but it's these really dramatic poses, very expression, a lot of expression, a lot of emotion. That's the Hellenistic. And then next, so that's where we move into the Republic. And you could kind of see how that makes sense, because if we're at the classical and we're seeing very serene, calm poses, kind of more elegant, and then we go to the Baroque, which is really dramatic, and these facial expressions that are very dramatic, then when we move to the late Republic, we start seeing a bit of a mix between the two, where they are serene, but they still have dramatic kind of anatomy, the really veristic facial portraits of them, that it's a little bit more dramatic than the classical, but not as dramatic as the Hellenistic. When we get to Augustus, though, we really see a reversion to the classicals. He was a big fan of the classical, he and Julius Caesar, and so we really see him imitating that, right? So the one right above him, Augustus looks very classical, very naturalistic, very idealized. And then when we start to move more into the middle of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, we start to see a reversion to the Republican, to that verism. So if we're here now, so that's the Julio-Claudian, and then we had the year of the 4 emperors, right? And we're going to now move into the Flavians. And this is Emperor Vespasian. So this is the first person in the Flavian dynasty. His name is Vespasian. Flavian is the family name, so that's kind of like a last name. Same with like the Julio-Claudians, right? So this guy's name is Vespasian, but his family is the Flavians. And Vespasian took power also in a militaristic way. So he defeated Vitellius in battle, ended up executing him in the middle of Rome, and taking power for himself. So something important to note about the year of the 4 emperors, in a way that it contrasts with the Julio-Claudians and the rule of Augustus, although maybe Augustus kind of started this, but the Julio-Claudians were a dynasty, so they inherited their power. There was a system of heirs and successors. With the year of the 4 emperors, we really see the office of emperor being taken by military force and by someone who is a military general. So it's not the succession anymore. And we really see a rise of, as I said, the office of emperor being tied to someone who is primarily a military leader. And so that more so than just an office like president or, you know, even like a king, we really see this as more of a military dictatorship at this point in the Roman Empire. And we're going to see that for a little bit of time. So as I said, Vespasian as well continued that. He was a military commander who is now emperor. And what we see in his portrait is the same thing that we've been seeing with the year of the 4 emperors and this return to verism. So he was quite old when he came into power. I think he was 60. He was 60 when he came into power, and he ruled for 10 years until his death. And we see his age again reflected in his portraiture. So these deep lines in the forehead, especially in the his eyelids as well, and then we see kind of crow's feet or creases coming out from there. Deep nasolabial lines, thin lips, which often happens when people get older. Their lips kind of lose definition, and so they have thinner lips. His ears are a little bit larger too, and then overall just a lot more wrinkles in the face. We see a receding hairline, right? So he's kind of balding. All of these things that show his age. And as I said earlier, he wants to show his age. He's not trying to hide it like Augustus. He wants to show his age because he wants to show that he is the best person to rule. So very important. Something else to note about this portrait as we move forward is that it is also very individualized. So remember, that kind of means it really looks like how he would have looked. And we'll see this with the Flavian dynasty because his successors, who are his 2 sons, will retain these same qualities to emphasize their familial ties, as we've seen with the Julio-Claudians too. But we see sort of family characteristics here that could be a little bit more accurate because they are a father and 2 sons. So yeah, a couple of the things are kind of, they have like blocky heads, kind of not super round heads. They're kind of square shaped in a way. And then also the lip shape as well, you'll kind of see moving forward. So overall, an individualized portrait, a naturalistic portrait, but much more realized or realistic than idealized, which is done as a political move. Here's another one just to show you that the portraiture was consistent, that we see this the same individualized image kind of exported across the empire. So here's just another one of him from his rule of Vespasian, and we see a very similar, that blocky head shape, same signs of age that I've talked about a lot. He's balding as well, kind of those same almost pursed lips, or kind of duck lips in a way, and the big ears as well. So one of the biggest things that Vespasian builds in the early years of his rule is the forum. So that when he gets into power, he almost immediately begins building a forum, and that forum, as you can see on the map, is right next to all the other forums. So this is a long-standing tradition now that the emperors always have to build their own forum. So here is the Roman forum, right? You can see there's this sacred way leading into it. We have Temple of Vesta, all the things we've talked about. Temple of Julius Caesar, right? The Arch of Augustus. And then the offshoot of it, right, is the, here's the Curia. So here we have the Forum of Julius Caesar, and then you should note, right, that that's kind of coming off perpendicular to the Forum of Julius Caesar is the Forum of Augustus with the Temple of Mars Ultor. So right to the south of that, right below that is where Vespasian is going to build his forum. So every emperor has to get a forum now. So it was dedicated in 75 CE. It's a large square, so it's more in square shape than rectangular. So we've talked a lot about how forums are always that long rectangular axis. This is a little bit different from that because we're seeing more of a square shape, but it's also surrounded by a colonnade, imported granite we see here. It has a major temple, as you see. We'll talk about that in a second. And then a couple other things. What was I going to say? Oh, yes, there's 2 libraries in it as well. So also that's kind of a new addition that we don't see in forums before, but we see some libraries that would have held texts of Greek and Latin works. But let's talk about the temple. The temple is the temple of peace. And in the apse of the temple, the cult statue was mounted on a podium. There was a figure of a personification of peace. So we've seen like a personification of Rome or of victories. This is the same kind of thing. It would have been this female figure who's representing peace. She held a palm frond in her right hand. And this is from coins evidence. We don't have the statue anymore. And she was flanked on either side by spoils from Jerusalem. And this is very important because this is also something that defines the Flavian Dynasty. A huge event for them was the conquest of Jerusalem and essentially the destruction of Jerusalem. So the Roman Empire is expanding, and had been in the Middle East for some time in that area. And what we see though is an escalation of hostilities between the Romans and the Jews. And this culminates with a battle at Masada in modern-day Israel, then Judea. And so prior to Vespasian taking power, right, I said that he was a military commander and he'd been a military commander for quite some time. And he was actually in Judea. He was fighting Jews in Judea. A note about the Romans and the Jews. So the Romans had taken over that area, but they were kind of, they were okay with each other. There wasn't a lot of tension brewing. The Romans kind of didn't get the Jews because they were a different religion. They didn't have that shared religion. And so there was always a little bit of tension there because that was a big thing, is that the Romans said, we don't care, who you worship really in the whole empire, as long as we can justify it under our own religion of polytheism, right? As long as we can kind of say, oh, you worship this like local god, well, okay, yeah, I could see that fitting in with the whole pantheon. The Jews, though, a little bit different, right? Because they have a monotheistic religion that doesn't fit into the Roman polytheism. You can't worship, the Jewish god and also Jupiter. That doesn't work for the Jews. So they're kind of cautiously on good terms, but don't really understand them. So they began to retake the province of Judea in the 60s CE, Vespasian, along with his son Titus. During this attempt to retake the area, Vespasian leaves to go become emperor, and he leaves his son Titus in charge. Titus finishes the job for his father, I suppose, and conquers Judea, destroys Jerusalem, and brings the spoils of war back to Rome. And as I said, that culminates on a battle here in Masada. The Jews had taken this mesa, this hilltop that you see here, and held off the Romans for quite a while until the Romans, who are camped kind of all around the base, you can see some remnants of that, built a ramp. And they built this ramp to get up to the hilltop and finally defeat the Jewish forces. But as I said, they when they conquer Judea, they bring many, many spoils of war back to Rome as evidence of this victory. And so we see a lot of that in the works of the Flavian Dynasty in Rome, and this is one of them, the Temple of Peace. You see the spoils of war in the temple, but even the dedication of the temple as being to peace, as a temple of peace, templum pacis, right? So we remember the ara pacis is the altar of peace. This is the temple of peace, is a reference to that, the fact that they have, created peace in Judea, which really just means that they conquered them. So I'm not really sure if that's peace, but to them it was peace. And it could also be a reference to Nero as well, right? The fact that we had this volatile reign of Nero, and then we had a year of 4 emperors, we had a civil war, and now finally we have Vespasian, who was a stable ruler. And so we're going to commemorate his stable reign with the Temple of Peace in his forum. So similar also, we see similar things. As I said, the Ara Pacis kind of had a similar message in both being dedicated to peace and representing this stable empire that has now been created. But the biggest thing that he builds, I guess quite literally, is the Flavian Amphitheater, otherwise known as the Colosseum. You can call it either way. The Colosseum is kind of a later term for it, so if they were referring to it in the Roman times, they would have called it the Flavian Amphitheater. And as I said, it is an amphitheater, so we have learned a lot about that now, that it is not a theater, right? It's not a half circle, it's a full circle, amphi, both theaters together. And it is built also nearby. So if you look on the map, Colosseum's always easy to pick out because it's that circle on the map. So you see that right here, and then you can see that the Templum Pacis is right nearby. Here's the Roman Forum, here's the Palatine Hill. So it's great because if you go there today, you can kind of see all of this stuff at once, right? You can do a little walking tour around the area. Important, though, to note also that the Colosseum was built on the site of Nero's Domus Aurea. So when Nero commits suicide, and when there is a transfer of power, and when Vespasian finally comes into power as a stable ruler, he reappropriates the land that Nero had taken after the Great Fire, right? So there was the big fire in Rome. Nero takes the land away from the people and builds his own palace, complete with a lake and colonnades and all this stuff, woodlands, right? So Vespasian takes that land back and decides to give it back to the people. So rather than taking it for himself, he doesn't say, oh, I'm just going to move into the Domus Aurea, like this is my place now because I'm emperor. He actually gives it back to the people. So he does that by building the Colosseum, which is essentially a public gift, because it's a space of entertainment, and so it's a public monument, kind of like the Theater of Pompey, right? We saw that as well, that he made this gift to the people for something that they could use, and they could use for entertainment. And Vespasian builds it on the site of that lake, the artificial lake that Nero had created in the Domus Aurea. So definitely a message being sent there, not only kind of back at the Julio-Claudians, but also to the people that, he's trying to make an effort to be more of an emperor for the people. So that's what we see in the Colosseum in its location. We're going to talk a lot about this. So just the first thing, it's materials. So it is made of concrete. Not sure that this would have been able to be done without concrete at the time. It has a concrete foundation, and then it is built of concrete faced by brick. And then also the exterior is faced with travertine, which is kind of that white marbly rock that is found near Rome. So travertine, so it would have looked nice and white and gleaming. Could have held anywhere between 50 to 80,000 people. So this is a huge structure, definitely something that you see in the capital in a very populated city. And it was actually the first permanent amphitheater built inside Rome. So the Pompey's Theater was the first theater, permanent theater built in Rome, and this is the first permanent amphitheater. And something else is just that, you know, as it being a gift to the people, there's that quote, you know, about bread and circuses makes a good leader. If you want to be a good leader, just give your people bread and circuses. And that's basically what's happening here, is that Vespasian is giving a gift to the people to kind of keep them entertained, keep them happy, make sure they don't overthrow him. What we also see is similar to the fact that it was built on the same land as the Domus Aurea. We also see that Colossus of Nero, right? That big statue of Nero in the guise of the sun god Sol that he had in his colonnade on his palace. We see that actually not during the reign of the Flavians, a little bit later. It was moved right next to the Colosseum, and it was no longer Nero, but it was just the sun god. It was just Sol. So it didn't have that connection, but they wanted to reuse it since it was such a massive and kind of spectacular work of art. And that is actually where we get the name Colosseum. So it actually doesn't come from the fact that it's a giant amphitheater. It comes from the fact that the Colossus of Nero stood outside of it, making it the Colosseum. A little bit more about the architecture itself. So we see something here called superimposed order. Superimposed order, you can see that at the top. And what this is when we have a multi-leveled structure that has different orders on every level. So each level is going to be a different order, like a different temple order. This is something that is very Roman, very characteristically Roman, and that is actually, we see it picked up in the Renaissance. So if you walk around Rome, a lot of the buildings that aren't even from the Roman period, but a lot of them from later on, you actually see this as well. This is really something that was picked up. But the superimposed order, so on the Colosseum, we see a great example of this. So on the bottom, right on the ground floor, we see something called the Tuscan Order. And this is something I know we haven't talked about yet. So the Tuscan Order is kind of the Roman update of the Doric Order. So the Doric Order, remember, that was way far back. That was in like the 5th century BC. And here we are now in the 1st century CE. So it could use an update. So what we see, if you want to compare, the biggest difference mostly is that it now sits on a base. So it sits on a base that's very similar to the Ionic column base, where it kind of is rounded and kind of has the base below it, sort of a round bottom and then more of a square base. But we still see similar unornamented capitals on that one, right? And also you'll notice here there's no fluting on these. So these are just more straight. But the Tuscan Order, so the Tuscan, that's what we're going to call that one, right? So it looks kind of like the Doric. If you didn't know better, you might think it was the Doric, but it's actually, we're going to call it something different. It's the Tuscan. It's this update of the Doric. And then above that, we have the Ionic, which you should know well. Above that, we have the Corinthian. And then above that, we actually have Corinthian pilasters. So they're not columns, but they're squared out, which makes them pilasters. Something also to note is that they are all engaged columns, right? So they're not freestanding, they are engaged because they are attached to that wall. So they are not the ones doing the structural work. It's not like, oh, we have to have these columns because otherwise our Colosseum will fall down. What's doing the work here is the arches, right? Those series of arches which create barrel vaults. That's what's going to be holding up the structure. But the columns are much more decorative, kind of to also reinforce this illusion of strength that, don't worry, this building is being held up. We got a lot of things working here. So it's sort of that, because when you have an arch, right, and you have a lot of open space, you can almost create the illusion that it's not a sturdy structure, right? Because it's like, oh, there's just a bunch of space holding it up. And so it kind of, I don't know, subtly influences you to think that the building looks more sturdy or looks as sturdy as it is, even though it doesn't have to look that sturdy. I don't know if that made sense, but yeah, so decorative choice to put these columns in this superimposed order. Something else about those arches that I was just talking about is that they would have held statues. So you would have entered through the arches on the ground floor, but then the levels above that would have held statues. And so not many of these survive today, but it definitely would have been a spectacular building to look at because it wouldn't have just been this really grand building. You also would have seen all of these statues in the all of the little arches. And you can see that here, that's what that's representing, is these statues. And then you can also see, it's kind of cool on this coin because they've kind of represented the people, right? You can see people sitting in the seats. And so kind of making you think about, oh, this is a busy day at the Colosseum, right? So if we look at the kind of inner workings of the Colosseum, again, we see that it's really reliant on barrel vaults. This system of barrel vaults is really important. And we also see that it's really important for entrance and exits. So that's how you get in. You walk in through these arches from the outside. And then in order to find your seat, like the amphitheater at Pompeii that we talked about in the theaters, it's all stratified. So you have different levels, and there was actually a ticketing system. So you would actually know where you were going to sit before you got there. And so then you would show up and you would know which arch to enter, and then you would go up all these stairs. So there's a bunch of staircases. You can kind of see them here. If you go there today, you can still walk up and down the staircases. And that's how you would get to your seat. And then there's these long barrel vaults that go around the outside. And so in a modern baseball stadium, that's where, you know, all the vendors would be. That's where you would buy your popcorn, your hot dog. I'm not sure if they had that in the Colosseum, but they definitely have the barrel vaults that go all the way around so that you can walk around the structure, access your seat, whatever it might be. And here is an example of the barrel vault. So this is on the ground floor. So if you were to walk in from the outside, this is the kind of, the colonnaded barrel vault, the gallery they're calling it, where you would walk around the structure. And so maybe if you walk in over here, but your seat's on the other side, you're gonna walk around to it, right? So it's just like a modern stadium. And a great example of the use of concrete and the use of barrel vaults. Here is an aerial shot of it today. So you can see also, the system of walkways and of stairs and all the different seating areas, but it's also really cool because you can see the stage itself, or the kind of central area. And today, what they've done is they've actually removed the floor so that you can see the underworkings of the stage, which is really cool because that's where all of kind of the backstage work was done. So this was where they would hold animals. So they would have beast hunts, you know, they would have these exotic animals brought in, and they would have them fight each other or fight a gladiator. So those would be kept down there. The gladiators also, anything that was going to be taken up above for part of the show, they would keep in these kind of cages or areas below the stage. And then when it was time, you would make your way up through an arch or out of an arch onto the stage. Also, something really unique about the Colosseum and kind of a cool piece of engineering is the fact that they were able to flood it. So they could actually flood the whole stage region and create like a mini lake. And what they would do there is they would reenact sea battles. So famous battles from antiquity, things like that. A famous one between the Athenians and the Persians was acted out here. And it was they would bring in ships, and it would be kind of a whole reenactment, like that scene of on the this is my second time referencing Pirates of the Caribbean, on the Pirates of the Caribbean ride at Disneyland, where you go in and they're like having that cannon battle. I feel like that's what it would have been like, except you're not on the water, you're watching it, but there's ships kind of fighting each other. Also a good picture so that you can see kind of where it is situated also. So this is the kind of getting into the Roman Forum over here, and then the statue of formerly Nero, now Sol, would have stood somewhere around here. Actually, is that the column base of it, or the base of it? Oh, I don't remember. I think they used to have the base that you could see, and I feel like they took it out or something. Okay, now I'm not sure. But yeah, that would have been over there. Anything else? Yes, okay, so this is a reconstruction of it. So remember, it would have been fully a full circle, right? It wouldn't have had that kind of slant that it has now. You can also see here the statues that would have stood in the arches and the velarium. So the velarium is this sunshade awning kind of roof that could be retracted to cover the amphitheater for weather purposes, so both for sun and for rain, and also to kind of help with the acoustics as well, and other things. We see velariums used for other purposes. But yes, so this is a retractable sunshade / awning, which is kind of nice, because if you're sitting there, you know, you're watching your gladiator fight and the sun is beating down. You've probably been at a baseball game or something where that's happened. It's got a retractable roof so that it can shade you from the sun. So lots of very interesting engineering techniques that we see here. So that's going to do it for the Colosseum. But just to remind you, the Colosseum, it was started in 70 and dedicated in 80. So it was started under Vespasian, but it was finished under his son Titus. So Titus is going to be the successor of Vespasian. He is Vespasian's son as well. And you'll remember that we talked about Titus when we talked about the Roman conquest of Judea, because Titus was the one who kind of took over after his father had to go become emperor. He was the one who took over as military commander there. And so then we see when Vespasian dies, Titus becoming emperor. Doesn't rule for very long, only 79 to 81, but in that span of time, the Colosseum is finished. So that's kind of associated with him. And what we have is some portraiture from him. So we can see, again, that he's making those links. He's perhaps making links to his father, but also just may have resembled his father because they were related. And so we see, again, that blocky head that's kind of characterizes the Flavians. He also is showing a little bit of age. He wouldn't have been as old as his father was when he took office, but we can see some lines in the forehead, right? He didn't get the sculpture equivalent of Botox to smooth that out like Augustus did. He left them in. We also see kind of a little bit of a receding hairline maybe, but then it's also kind of, there's a lot of hair happening. We see his lips as well are kind of those like little kind of duck lips a little bit. He's got that dimple in his chin and those big ears also. So again, just looking similar to his father in an individualized portrait, a very Flavian portrait. Here we see again, just to reinforce the consistent portraiture, this consistent image that we have in all of his portraiture, that he looks very similar, the same characteristics we see there. And also on his coins, we see it as well in these profile views of him, but we see that strong chin and kind of that blocky face also. And this is an interesting coin that he had minted also because it represents the capture of Judea. So if you remember from Augustus, he minted a coin about the capture of Egypt, right, with that alligator. And so that's what we see here. We kind of see a palm tree and a personification of Judea, who is like a captured enemy that we've seen, like that, you know, when they would depict kind of Parthians or people like that, we see something similar where this perhaps Jew is in being captured by the Romans. So this was something that really was associated with Titus, and that was his defining legacy in a way, was that he was the one who conquered Judea. His wife was a woman by the name of Marcia Furnilla, and you can see some of her portraiture here. So if you're doing the paper on representations of women in Roman art, this is an important little part for you. So Marcia Furnilla, the wife of Titus, and what we see here is her in a nude statue, which is a bit interesting. The Romans didn't really do that very often, but she's doing so to directly reference the Aphrodite of Kinitos statue, a very famous statue from Greek antiquity. We see Roman copies being made of the Greek original. We actually have multiple examples of the Aphrodite of Kinitos. It was kind of one of those famous statues that was often reproduced. And so it would have originally stood in the temple at Kinitos, which I think we actually looked at, that Tholos. And it was a big deal at the time because it was a statue that represented a female goddess in the nude. And this was seen as something a bit scandalous when it came out in the Greek era, because it was almost like, whoa, are we like allowed to do that? Like, are we allowed to represent a goddess in the nude? And kind of, is that kind of appropriate or allowed? Or are we going to get smited for that? And what we see here is actually her bathing. So she's preparing to bathe. And so there's sort of an explanation maybe for why she's nude, and she holds kind of maybe what she would have been wearing there. And so for Marcia Furnilla, we see her acting in the guise of Aphrodite of Kinitos. So we've seen that before, where was it Claudius's wife or his mother? I think we saw her looking like Venus Genetrix, right? And so here we see Marcia Furnilla taking on the guise of Aphrodite, and specifically the Aphrodite of Kinitos. So she is also in the nude. She has this kind of posture with her hand over her breast, and then her other hand kind of on her lower part. And so we see sort of an idealized body type. Her body looks quite young, right? It looks, idealized in the way that Aphrodite's does in our original, image. But what we see is her face not looking as idealized. So her face a little bit shows the signs of age. She doesn't look super young. She's got some lines on her face as well. And so keeping in tradition with these veristic tendencies to be a little bit more realistic. But something that we see that you probably can't miss is her hairdo. And this is a very famous hairdo. This is the Flavian hairdo. If you see a woman, a female statue with this hairdo, you can almost always date it to the Flavians because this was the style at the time. And so what we see is the empress, right, the wife of the emperor, having this hairstyle, and then we see it also in many others. So kind of the influence that the fashions, the imperial fashions that trickled down. So that hairstyle we can really mark as a Flavian. And we'll see that a bit more later on. But let's stick with Titus. Perhaps the biggest monument associated with Titus is the Arch of Titus. This stood also in Rome, also kind of in the center of Rome, quite close to the Colosseum, actually. So you can see the Colosseum here, and then this is the Roman Forum here. And then we have the Arch of Titus almost linking the two, so linking between the Colosseum and the Roman Forum. This was a triumphal arch, so it was it's quite large, and it was to celebrate his triumph in Judea. As I said, his kind of defining legacy or event in his life was this conquest of Judea, and so that's what we see on his triumphal arch that was erected for him. It was actually erected for him after his death. He died kind of early and unexpectedly at the age of, I'm not sure what age, but it was in 81, which was only 2 years after he took power. And his brother Domitian is going to erect this triumphal arch in his honor. And so it's really well preserved. So we'll kind of look at some of the different things that you see there. The first thing, though, is that the inscription talks about that, about his legacy and the fact that it's dedicated to Titus. If we look a little bit closer, we see, so in the center, so if you look at this kind of central area, that's where most of the decoration is, so we'll be looking at that. And we're going to look right there. These are called spandrels. So the spandrel is this roughly triangular area. It's almost triangular, but then it curves because it's over an arch. So these are both spandrels, and in the spandrels we see depictions of the personification of victory. So once again, like the personification of peace that we saw in Vespasian's forum, we see the personifications of victory here, representing the triumph over Judea, the Roman victory. We also see some Corinthian columns, lots of vegetal decoration. We have a great look at some coffers, right? So we haven't seen those in a while. Coffers on the ceiling of the arch. So you walk through the arch, you can look up and see the coffers. And then just many other, depictions here on this frieze. We have a continuous frieze and more sculpture. If we look a little bit closer, so again, these coffers, quite well preserved. They have that kind of rosette in the middle. And we see decoration on this arch as well. And something important to note is that this triumphal arch often would have been when or where triumphs took place. So a triumph, I think, as I've talked about, is kind of like a parade. It's a parade that a military leader would have had after a victory, like after the Super Bowl, maybe the Buccaneers, well, maybe not now because of COVID, but normally they would get on these tour buses and they would go through the city of Tampa, right? But that's the same thing that would happen here after a military victory. The troops, led by their leader, would come through the city of Rome, and people would line the streets and cheer for them. And what would happen is they would go through other triumphal arches, so other ones that had been erected by military leaders who came before them. So this, we see a lot of not just victorious imagery, of images of victory, but also images of triumph, of the actual triumph that would have taken place, as people walked through this arch. So as you just came back from battle and now you're part of a triumph and you're walking through these arches that have other scenes of triumphs that are actually like the one that you're doing. So it's kind of very meta. It's referencing the event that would have taken place at the arch. So we're going to look at this one a little bit more closely. So this is a relief image on the inside of the arch, as you saw. It's done in quite high relief. So these images that are the figures who are closer to us are almost in the round. They're almost entirely sculpted. You can almost see the back of their head there. So very high relief for those figures, but then we do see much shallower relief for the people in the back. So that's kind of creating this sense of depth, because you have the people in the back who feel farther away because they're in lower relief, and then the people in the front who feel closer to you because they're in higher relief. And a reason that we know that this is commemorating the victory over Judea is because of this massive menorah. And so this is commemorating the Romans taking spoils, as I said, from Jerusalem, taking them back to Rome and displaying them in the city. And that's what we see here as a direct reference to that, to the victory over the Jewish people. And what we are seeing here is a depiction of a triumph. So what we're seeing is these men are carrying things like the menorah. These are these spoils that they brought back from Jerusalem, and they're now in the city of Rome, and they're in this triumph. People are cheering for them, and they're carrying their spoils of war through the streets. And it's quite accurate, in the fact that they're even entering an arch, like a triumphal arch, as I said. They're going through a triumphal arch, and even the direction that they're facing, if we go back here, the direction that they're facing is actually toward the Capitoline Hill, which is where triumphs would have ended. So we see sort of a realistic depiction of a triumph here, them bringing the spoils of war back and parading them through the city of Rome as a sign of their victory. We also see here a depiction of Titus. So Titus as the military leader who completed this victory, but also he is no longer alive, right? Because this was erected after his death. And so what we're seeing is his apotheosis, which means his becoming a god. He is becoming a god after his death, right? And so we see that he's kind of on the back of an eagle being brought up to the heavens, and that is representing he is joining the divine pantheon. And we see that with Vespasian too. When Vespasian died, Titus had him officially declared a god. And so now that Titus has died, we see his brother Domitian doing the same thing, declaring him a god as well. And that is depicted on his own triumphal arch, right? So a very Titus-heavy monument. And again, we see this, this is a second image of Titus. So this is again referencing the triumph that would have taken place, that parade that would have taken place after the troops returned from Jerusalem. And we see Titus in sort of a chariot being pulled by horses. So he is going to be that figure here. He is the figure of honor in all of this. It looks a bit, something to note is that his garments look a little bit more classical. So if we go, these aren't super well preserved. If we go here though, they look kind of Roman, where they've kind of got that cinching and then the little skirt that Romans wear. But here, this very like large drapery that goes over the shoulder looks a little bit more classical, which could reference the fact that he is also part of the pantheon, right? That it's kind of, he's timeless now. He's joined history. He's no longer existing in the present moment like the others are, who are wearing contemporary clothing of that time, but he's sort of in the guise of a god or of a historical figure. We also see a personification of honor behind him, kind of, I think, maybe crowning him. So also, a reference to sort of divine connections. So as I said, that was erected after Titus's death, and it was erected by his brother Domitian. So Domitian was the second son of Vespasian. Probably didn't expect to become emperor, but when Titus died quite early, he took up the position. So he reigned from 81 to 96. And Domitian will be the last one of the Flavian dynasty because he was not super well liked. And when people are not well liked, a change in power often comes shortly after. So he was a little bit too much of an authoritarian. He had quite a heavy hand. He was a hard ruler, and he wasn't very well liked by the Senate, and that is very important. And I don't know if I've mentioned that even though we have an emperor, even though Augustus was our first emperor, he never dissolved the Senate because he wanted to give the impression that there was still some kind of Republican influence here, that there wasn't a huge change of government. So we still have a Senate. Yes, I'm the emperor and I'm making all the decisions, but there's a Senate as kind of a figurative body, and I think they maybe would kind of work in an administrative capacity and would carry out works. But the emperor was really the one in charge. However, if the Senate doesn't like you, that might mean that your time as emperor will not last long because there's more of them than there are of you. So it was very important to have the approval and support of the Senate. And Domitian did not have that. The Senate, they quite liked his father and his brother, but they did not like him. And again, probably because he was not supposed to be emperor, and so there could have been some kind of hostility there too, that they felt like he was not quite as legitimate. But in this portrait bust that we see of him, we do see, again, individualization, and we see him looking a bit also like his father and his brother. He doesn't have as blocky of a head here, although that'll change a little bit in other portraits. He also has the dimple in his chin like his father and his brother had. He has those big ears, but interestingly, he is not balding. He has quite a lot of hair, almost maybe too much hair, you might think. And that is because he probably was bald, but he was wearing a wig, and he was very self-conscious about this. So don't bring up the wig, but we're going to bring up the wig because, you know, enough time has passed. But he was totally bald and wore a wig, and so that would have been similar too. Also the same kind of mouth, right? You'll notice that kind of small duck mouth in a way or something, and a long pointy nose also. And so just to compare, excuse me, should have brought this maybe up sooner, but yes, so here we see a comparison. He's not looking as identical as Titus and Vespasian do. Those two I feel like look very similar. He's a little bit thinner, but definitely some similar traits, and I think he does look much like Titus. So just again, that connection, that family connection, this is the Flavian Dynasty, which represents family. Domitian's wife was Domitia Longina, and I wanted to bring her up so you see her here, and then Titus's wife is here, because she has that Flavian hairstyle, but it's getting even bigger. And as time goes on in the Flavians, we see that hairstyle grow, and so she has the same kind of coiffed, circular, you know, these little circles, these little like rolls of hair that Marcia had, but Domitia has kind of brought it up higher, almost looks like a modern tiara or something. And so it's also a bit of a veristic image of her, not super idealized. She doesn't look super young or kind of airbrushed. And so just to compare with Marcia. And then we also see some other sculptures of women from this era. So this is, we don't know who this is, but it's some kind of woman that lived in the time of the Flavians, and we see again that hairstyle really on full display here. Those ringlets that have kind of been brought up and then into a big kind of coiffed hairstyle around her face. All of these ringlets, very elaborate. So she was probably someone from the upper class to have such an elaborate hairdo and to have this bust made. But again, showing the fashions of the time and a good way to date these sculptures, because we know that was the Flavian hairstyle, and we see different hairstyles different times. Something to note about her also is that she actually does look much more idealized, right? She looks much more airbrushed and maybe a little bit more goddess-like than Domitia does. So we also see a difference there, and that maybe again Domitia wants to give a bit of legitimacy to her husband's reign, so that she, you know, has maybe depicted with some experience, or kind of maybe giving her even herself some power, and the fact that she's actually not as attractive. We can compare her to the bust of the Flavian lady, who looks much more idealized, a bit younger, all of that. So Domitian also kind of broke with tradition, though, because in the way that he depicted his brother Titus on the Arch of Titus, right? As I mentioned, Titus was shown becoming a god, right? He is being taken up to heaven, and Vespasian was made a god as well. Domitian changes this, and this also might be one of the reasons the Senate was not too fond of him, because prior to this, the emperor had been referred to as the princeps, similar to our modern word for prince, right? But it comes from a word meaning the first citizen. He is like the first citizen of all the citizens, you know, kind of like the first lady, but it's the first citizen. That was the emperor's title. Domitian does not call himself princeps. He is not the first citizen. He is Domitian Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. And this is a huge break with tradition, a big change that we see, because he is no longer subtly hinting, like Augustus or his predecessors did, that maybe he's divine, maybe he's, you know, going to be part of the pantheon someday. And if you want to think he's a god now, okay. No. Domitian is saying, I am Lord and God. I am a god right now, as I live. That is my title, so that is what I am. So we don't see that kind of hesitation anymore. We see this confidence in him directly saying that he is a god, and it does kind of make sense because his brother and his father had already been deified, so there was less subtlety, because it was like, well, obviously, I mean, we all know I'm already going to become a god because they were both made gods, so we might as well just say it now. But still, definitely a change, right? a departure from the norm, Dominus et Deus. And we see this in the Temple of the Sebastoy, also called the Temple of Domitian. Sebastoy is related to the Greek word for emperor, in Ephesus, so that's in modern-day Turkey. Constructed during Domitian's rule, and it is dedicated to Domitian essentially, and to his family, kind of all of the Flavians actually. And so we see, it's important for a couple reasons, because we see worship of Domitian during his lifetime as a god. We see a temple erected to him as a god in his lifetime, but also in the provinces. So we see this out in Ephesus, out in Asia Minor, that it's being set up as part of the town there so that people in the provinces can worship the emperor far away. And perhaps some of that distance also made it a bit more plausible, because if you don't see the emperor, right, you can maybe better imagine that he might be a god, because you don't see him on the streets every day in Rome. He's sort of far enough away that you can almost picture him as a god more. This temple also would have had something to represent his worship, which is the Colossus of Domitian. So we start to see a lot of these massive statues, right? These larger than life statues that would have been like stories tall, like the Colossus of Nero. We see the Colossus of Domitian. This would have stood outside the temple, and we see him, and it's interesting because there's a little bit of a deviation here from his portraiture, so I think it's just kind of a funny, he kind of looks like a giant baby, but it looks a little bit less like his the portrait that we saw in Rome. He has kind of a rounder face and just a few different features. We see these really nice curls are still maintained. He must have told them, like, you got to get the wig right. But it doesn't look as standardized as the portraiture that we see in Rome. And this is, again, perhaps because we were out in the provinces, and so there was a little bit more leeway. Maybe it wasn't the official imperial sculptors making this. Maybe it was people out in the provinces, and so they're kind of working off other representations that they've seen and taking some leeway. So we see this outside of the temple, and we see Domitian being worshipped in his lifetime. Something else is that he builds is the Palace of Domitian on the Palatine Hill. So the Palatine Hill was where the emperors lived, starting with Augustus. Augustus, you can see on the map, the plan built a large palace there, and then Domitian adds to it, building the Domus Flavia. So that's what we're seeing here on the Palatine Hill. It was also huge, so it kind of was a Domus Aurea a little bit again, kind of that situation where it was a huge palace. He took over the area of a bunch of earlier imperial palaces to build this. It had lots of peristyles and gardens with fountains, so it was very lush. We see a stadium that you see here, a stadium inside the palace itself. So that's what we're seeing, this one here. That's what we're looking at. See that curve? You can see that, and then there's the colonnade on either side. So that's what we're looking at. Domitian seemed to be a big fan of stadiums. So this stadium was actually built prior. So this is a huge stadium called the Circus Maximus, and we'll look at that in a second, but that was already there. And so then Domitian builds his own stadium kind of within his own palace a little bit closer. So just to look a little bit, again, we see a huge use of concrete in Domitian's palace, lots of barrel vaults, barrel arches, right? Here we actually start to see a groin vault. So you can see the way that they're coming together. It's kind of like creating an X shape with two barrel vaults. It's going to be called a groin vault. And again, a way to kind of create hallways that meet. So a lot of concrete. Here's an example of a garden that would have had like a fountain in it, and then it would have had plants around it, a peristyle as well. So very, very lavish. As I said, the Circus Maximus. So if we look, I want to talk a little bit about stadiums, because we did talk about the Colosseum earlier, which was a big entertainment space. We've talked about theaters, but we haven't talked much about stadiums. So the major stadium that existed in Rome was the Circus Maximus, and the Circus Maximus was located right next to the Palatine Hill, and you can see it, it's right on the edge here. And so it's actually, there's a bit of an elevation change. So if you're standing on the Palatine Hill, you can look down into the Circus Maximus. And the Circus Maximus was actually first constructed during the regal period, and then it was continuously updated ever since. So this is what it looks like today. And it's actually kind of funny because I think that's generally what it would have looked like in the regal period. There wasn't a lot of standing architecture. But by the time we get to the imperial period, we really see a lot of standing architecture. We see seats for spectators. We see an arch here at the end. And then also we saw this middle part which had obelisks and other kind of statuary type things. And stadiums are where chariot races are held. So chariot races, foot races as well, all take place in stadiums. They're not going to take place in the Colosseum or in an amphitheater. An amphitheater is for gladiator fights and executions and beast fights, but the stadiums are for chariot races and foot races. So this is the Circus Maximus right next to the Palatine Hill. As I said, Domitian builds his own stadium inside his palace on the Palatine Hill, but he also builds his own stadium out in the Campus Martius. This is yet another stadium. This is the Stadium of Domitian. So when we say the Stadium of Domitian, we mean this one. We don't mean the one in his palace. And if you look on the map, it's way out in the Campus Martius right here. That's it there. So it's actually kind of near the Theater of Pompey, right? It's out in that area. We don't have much, really anything left of it today. Here is an arch that we see, but it would have maintained a traditional stadium shape, which is that it's really long and ovular. So it's very skinny, like a very skinny oval. You can also see that it would have held stands for spectators, and then they would have watched it down below. And then it would have had almost like a Scene Franz type thing, where it kind of has this backdrop against one end. So this was dedicated in 86 CE, another gift to the city, right? Bread and circuses. So here we have another instance of that, of Domitian giving the people a place of entertainment in the hopes of earning their favor. Just something kind of interesting to note, though, because this is the Stadium of Domitian, and today, actually, if you've been to Rome or seen photos, one of the most iconic piazzas in Rome is the Piazza Novona, and that actually sits on the same exact site of the Stadium of Domitian. And so you can see that it retains the same outline. So this is a reconstruction, and this is what it looks like today. And again, similar to the Theater of Pompey, it follows the same lines of the ancient stadium today. And that is because there's a church there dedicated to St. Agnes, who was said to have been martyred in the stadium. So there's a church built to her there, and so they've kind of preserved the shape of the stadium, although today it's just a piazza, and there's lots of fountains and cafes and things like that around. So interesting to see the legacy of ancient Rome today. As I said, though, Domitian was not super well liked, especially among the Senate. He would eventually be assassinated, and it's even said that his wife may have had a role in working with the Senate to assassinate him. And when he is assassinated, his legacy is not preserved, essentially. And that is something called Damnatio Memorial, which means essentially the condemnation of memory. And this was something that we see in the Roman Empire when there was an emperor or other prominent figure who people did not like. What they would do is they would destroy their likenesses because they don't want them to exist anymore. They don't want to have to walk by a statue of someone they hated every day. So we saw that a little bit with Nero, and the fact that they kept the statue, but they repurposed it as like the sun god, that it's not Nero now, it's the sun god. And we see that here in this equestrian statue of Domitian, and that it was initially a statue of Domitian, but they later replaced the face with his successor, Nerva. So they said, well, we have a perfectly good statue, and so we don't want to like get rid of the entire statue because, you know, it was probably expensive and took time to create. But we don't like Domitian anymore, and we don't want to see him every day. So we're going to replace his face on this statue with Nerva, who we do like. And so Damnatio Memorial, an important practice to note, because we see this a lot throughout Roman history, that there was an awareness of their history. There was an awareness of kind of cultural memory, of national memory, in that we don't want to see people who we have bad impressions of, and we don't want them to continue to be part of our historical record for future generations. We want to damn their memory, essentially. So that's what we see happening with Domitian. If you remember on the Colossus of Domitian, we also see some destruction on his face, and it's thought that maybe that same practice occurred there, that the people in Ephesus, you know, because he turned out of favor with them, his face was kind of smashed in, and the Colossus was no longer used as a Colossus of Domitian. So that is where we're going to leave it today. Next time, we'll talk about Nerva just for a little bit. He didn't rule for too long. We will mostly be looking at Nerva's successor, Trajan, who had a lot of prominent works, and so he gets his own lecture all by himself. So that'll be next time, and I'll see you then.